I wanted to thank you all for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Albert Trithart. I'm the editor and research fellow at the International Peace Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion on the UN's policy and programming on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, for which I'll be using the acronym SOGIESC. I'd especially like to welcome our partners on this event, Outright Action International, the Center for Gender and Politics at Queen's University, Belfast, and the permanent missions of the Netherlands and Argentina to the UN. We're going to be focusing on today are the efforts of UN agencies to positively impact the lives of LGBTI people around the world. At least to some extent, and in some areas of its work, the UN has been considering the needs and interests of LGBTI people for more than 25 years. But in the past several years, the UN has stepped up its level of engagement. Notably, 6 years ago this month, 12 UN entities came together to issue a joint call for an end to violence and discrimination against LGBTI people. It was an unprecedented move. Today, we have representatives from 3 of those UN entities joining us to talk about how they've been translating this call to action into practice. These 3 agencies speak to how the UN is increasingly engaging with LGBTI people across its different areas of work. We'll be hearing from Karin Santi on UNDPs efforts to ensure that sustainable development efforts are inclusive of LGBTI people. We'll be hearing from Gregory Garris on how the UN Refugee Agency is assisting LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers. And we'll be hearing from Sophie West Brown on how UN Women is increasingly pushing beyond the gender binary. And these are only a few examples. In the area of human rights, I'd be remiss not also to mention the efforts of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as the UN's independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, who was mandated by the Human Rights Council in 2016 to put in place a high-level advocate for protecting LGBTI people around the world from violence and discrimination. And I'll also give mention to the many other agencies that I know are engaged on this topic, including UNAIDS, WHO, ILO, IOM, UNESCO, the UN Population Fund, UNODC, the World Bank, and others. This progress within the UN would not have been possible without the support of actors outside the UN. Member state advocates like Argentina and the Netherlands who are joining us today, as well as the other members of the LGBTI core group. And then, of course, the relentless efforts of civil society groups like Outright Action International, whose UN program officer, Sahar Moazzami, is joining us today. But gaps remain. The UN Peace and Security Pillar, for example, has been somewhat slower to consider the needs of LGBTI people in conflict-affected settings, as we'll be hearing about today from Professor Jamie Hagan. Even where progress has been faster, it hasn't always been easy, and political, financial, bureaucratic, and cultural barriers remain. If you're interested in more detail on these challenges, as well as a history of how the UN became engaged in SOGIESC and some recommendations on the way forward, I'll refer you to the paper on this topic that I wrote earlier this year, which is linked to on the webpage for this event, and that we'll also share a link to in the chat on Zoom. For now, I'd like to turn it over to Ambassador Joke Brandt, permanent representative of the Netherlands to the UN, to provide some opening remarks. We'll then hear from each of our panelists for about 5 minutes, and we'll then move to a Q&A session. If you have any questions, I'd encourage you to ask them in the Q&A chat on Zoom. So now over to you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Albert, and good morning, afternoon, evening, dear friends and colleagues. It's indeed my pleasure to be joining Albert here and welcoming you to, at least for New York's morning virtual event. And let me start by emphasizing that the Kingdom of the Netherlands and Argentina are proud to be co-chairing the LGBTI core group here in New York. Our overarching goal is to work within the framework of the UN for universal respect for the human rights and fundamental freedoms of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex person, while we're particularly focusing on protection from violence and discrimination. With the core group, we raise awareness, we publish statements, and we push for inclusive language in UN resolutions, because we have to be clear. We cannot achieve any of our goals and ambitions, including the Sustainable Development Goals, when violence and discrimination of LGBTI persons is still an everyday reality in many places around the world, especially in those countries where issues around sexual orientation or gender identity are still criminalized. I want to thank the International Peace Institute, Outright Action International, and the Centre for Gender in Politics at Queen's University Belfast for organizing today's event. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Albert for his insightful report on what progress the UN has made when it comes to the inclusion of all persons, regardless of sexual orientation, gender and identity and expression, and sex characteristics. Having worked for the UN myself, very early on in this struggle, I'm happy to see that the report concludes that there indeed has been progress in the UN. We have seen more support for statements and resolutions relating to SOGIE or diversity language. An independent expert on SOGIE mandated by the Human Rights Council has been appointed, and several UN agencies are doing a good job in implementing programs that are inclusive of or completely focused on LGBTI persons. And I think we'll go to hear from some of them later on. Of course, I guess like for all of us, there's always room for improvement. And so there's also room for improvement with the UN to make sure that LGBTI persons are truly never left behind. I'm looking forward to hearing from the speakers today and to the discussion, especially on how the UN can move forward even further and how we as a core group here can help so that the vision of a UN for all can indeed become a reality. Thank you, Albert.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you as well for your efforts in really pushing forward this conversation at the UN along with the other members of the LGBTI core group, which I understand is one of the most active groups of friends of member states within the UN. I'll now turn over to Sophie West-Brown, who is the Diverse SOGIESC Rights Specialist for UN Women. Over to you, Sophie.
Thanks, Albert, and thanks so much for having me here. And congratulations on your fascinating work. I've really enjoyed spreading it around. I'll just preface my presentation by saying it's very late at night where I am, so bear with me. I'll start in the limited time I have. What I want to do is just introduce the post that I sit in and UN Women's approach to LGBTIQ+ rights work. And then quickly just locate that portfolio within the UN Women context and expand a bit on how UN Women thinks and works in this area, and then more specifically provide some country level examples. So I'll start with my post. As Albert mentioned, I'm the Global Diverse SOGIESC Rights Specialist at UN Women. So maybe some of you know that this was established last year in Pride Month. So we're in the second year. It's the first ever dedicated post for UN Women to have working on these issues. It's a historic step forward for UN Women and the UN system in many regards, as there's very few people working in a full-time capacity at the global level on these issues. So UN Women's intention here is to really try and become more of a global leader in moving from rhetorical attention to LGBTIQ+ rights issues to more concrete action. And it really indicates progress in UN Women's strategic and conceptual thinking and acting on these issues in the context of its gender equality mandate. So more specifically on how the portfolio is located in UN Women. So like I mentioned, it sits at the global level and it supports our global, regional and country level operations. It works across multiple strategic areas of our work and across our triple mandate. So including human rights, humanitarian and development streams. It straddles UN Women's different branches, which are policy, program and intergovernmental, and works across our four thematic priority areas, which are governance, violence, economic empowerment, and peace, security, and humanitarian action. And it also, of course, is integral to our other critical intersecting work areas like health and migration, age and disability. And as UN Women embarks on its new 5-year strategic plan, it's also going to be a key part in a new cross-cutting area of work, which is on social norms change. So in addition to all of that, if that's not enough, it's a big part of the role is also to be collaborating on interagency efforts and civil society efforts to progress this agenda, as well as enhancing internal efforts to improve workplace culture in UN Women and across the system. And of course, developing institutional positioning and advising on strategic prioritization efforts in UN Women. So just to pick up a little bit more on that last point about positioning, I just wanted to be clear from the outset on where UN Women stands. So UN Women sees itself as a rights-based feminist organisation that takes an intersectional feminist approach to its work. So that means it also sees that having a gender equality mandate carries a responsibility to address how gender-based discrimination and violence impacts all gendered people. So, of course, this is also occurring against a backdrop of anti-gender narratives that many of us are facing, but we really see this as impetus to push harder and stand our ground in this area, and also act as a unifying force for gender equality activists that work across the various related movements. So how do we put this into practice? We have a 4-part framework that's under development that's designed to be applicable to all of our areas of work. And the 4 parts of that, broadly speaking, are inclusivity, intersectionality, specificity, and evidence-based. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to elaborate on any of that. And of course, everything I've mentioned so far sort of opens up the opportunity to talk about different angles of UN Women's work, but I've been asked to focus more specifically on what we're doing in the field and provide a few country examples. So I'll just jump to that very quickly. So just to say first that there's been huge momentum amongst our staff and partners globally to work on these issues at local levels, and that includes in very hostile contexts. So we're navigating how to do that in very different country environments. Also to say UN Women is a comparatively young and small part of the UN. And so in many senses, this presents a great opportunity to institutionalize this area of work. But at the same time, we're up against various challenges, from resources and capacity to political tensions and personal risks against our officers and our staff, as I'm sure many people here are familiar with encountering as well. So just quickly on the internal facing of that work, a big part of it is about building institutional capacity. So we do that through technical guidance and exploring training opportunities, the establishment of a global network and cross-regional knowledge building and sharing mechanisms, etc. And then the external facing requires contextualizing and taking nuanced approaches to that global blueprint of the 4-part framework that I mentioned, and to obviously have to navigate the risks and tensions in particular country context. So of course, the entry points look different depending on the country, and in more open places, we can progress in ways that we can't in other places, and in more hostile environments, we have to work with more discretion and in some cases, somewhat confidentially, to protect people's safety and security. So some quick examples of the different ways in which we work. So in terms of building the evidence base, which is a big thing for us, in Nepal, we have research underway on violence that was identified as a key gap and need by LGBTIQ+ rights organisations in Nepal. And so we're collaborating with organisations there on that. And being a comparatively more open environment, the aims of the research there are more open and around advocacy and promoting law and policy reform. Whereas, for example, in hostile settings, we still do research, but like I mentioned, it's in more of a sort of confidential way, and the aims of that would be quite different then around strategizing ways forward in those environments. Another way in which we work is building sector capacity, for example, in the humanitarian sector. In Asia and the Pacific, we have a regional initiative that's been underway with Edge Effect and a coalition of civil society organisations We've created a tool for humanitarian organisations to monitor and evaluate inclusivity in those environments. It's been piloted in Cox's Bazar. It's a first of a kind tool and it carries great potential. It also builds on analysis of a recent joint publication that we came out with called The Only Way Is Up. Another way in which we work is supporting civic engagement. For example, in Liberia, which is a very different setting to some of the others, where stigma and discrimination are rife and access to justice issues are considerable, we're engaging with civil society through sexual and gender-based violence work, harmful traditional practices work, SRH, and HIV interventions, for example. And then a last example of a way in which we work is enhancing systemic capacities. So in Lebanon, we've established a task force of agencies, donors, NGOs and other partners for strategy and advocacy purposes and to provide cross-sectoral support. And we do a lot of work there on filling knowledge gaps in the humanitarian system and undertaking more expansive gender analyses and promoting expansive understandings of gender. So I know I sort of raced through that in the interest of time and I still probably took too long. Sorry about that, but just to conclude, you know, that there is an ever increasing demand and interest to work in this area. And it's just a matter of us figuring out how we can keep up with that with our limited capacities. So I look forward to hearing from others, and unfortunately I can't stick around for the entire event, so apologies in advance, but I'd be very happy to keep in touch with anyone hereafter. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And yeah, Sophie is joining us from Australia, so especially thank you for joining us at this late hour for you. I think UN Women is a great example of the relatively rapid recent progress in institutionalizing this work, with your own position being an example of that. And as you mentioned, you're one of the very few people within the UN system who is focused on this topic full time, though of course there's still a long way to go to institutionalize this work. I'll turn over now to Karin Santi, who is the regional team leader for HIV health and development in UNDPs Latin America and the Caribbean office in Panama. Over to you, Karin.
Thank you so much, Albert, and thank you for having me. Colleagues, what I'm going to try and do is to provide a short overview of UNDP's work more broadly, and then specifically on the work that we do in the Caribbean. So UNDP started working on issues related to sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression since in 2007, around 2007. Well, initially the work was done in the context of responding to HIV. By 2009, UNDP was working more broadly on inclusive development for LGBTI people. Over the past 15 years, UNDP has worked in almost 100 countries to include LGBTI people and issues in development efforts. And the work is focused on improving service delivery for excluded populations, promoting protective laws and increasing access to justice, shifting discriminatory social norms, support inclusion in governance and democratic processes, and to increase and improve the evidence base related to LGBTI people in low and middle income countries. Now, Sophie talked about different approaches, and what we found is that one of the approaches that UNDP is employed is to do this work through a regional program. So often when you can't focus on a national context, if you work in a regional program, it facilitates working in sometimes difficult contexts. So we have implemented, most of you will know, the Being LGBTI in Asia program, which is first of the regional programs, and then subsequently in Eastern Europe, and since 2018 in the Caribbean, and as well as the Africa-focused inclusive governance initiative. Now, for the Being LGBTI in the Caribbean, as I've already said, the project we started implementation in 2018 and supported about, I guess, more than 1,500 human rights defenders working in Barbados, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Guyana, Grenada, St. Lucia, and often convening LGBTI community members with key decision makers in events like national dialogues, or recently in April, we also had a regional LGBTI dialogue with participation from all the countries. Through this work, we also focused on sensitizing key decision makers, including judges and parliamentarians. For example, in Haiti, training on human rights has been incorporated in the curriculum of the Judicial Academy. And while in UNDP partnered last year with Parliamentarians for Global Action to host a forum in the Eastern Caribbean, a parliamentarians forum that highlighted opportunities for greater socioeconomic inclusion of LGBTI persons. And other examples, for example, in Dominican Republic, UNDP supported LGBTI organizations to participate in consultative processes for the design of the national gender and youth policies. Also in the Dominican Republic, we partnered with UNHCR and the protection of refugees and asylum seekers. This work resulted in the development of a directory that provided an overview of services that migrants and asylum seekers can access nationally, including those services provided by LGBTI CSOs. So then maybe to shift a little bit, but in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we worked with UNAIDS and other partners to ensure attention to LGBTI populations in COVID relief efforts in the Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Haiti. And we also did a study that covered Grenada, St. Lucia, Barbados, and Guyana to look at the impact of COVID-19 on LGBTI persons. And the results of that study were shared during the Parliamentarians Forum in the Eastern Caribbean that we did together with PGA. Of course, another important area of work is data collection to inform inclusive policies and practices. So last month, we launched the results of the first ever national LGBT survey in the Dominican Republic. And in October this year, we will launch national Being LGBT reports covering all the project countries. Then let me say that, of course, this work has been implemented in close partnership with both national and regional LGBT organizations. Beyond working together, we've also had supported the CSOs through a small grants program, where over the past year, I think we have issued about 38 grants totaling about $300,000 to regional and national organizations. And this basically allowed CSOs to advance their own program priorities. So the call for proposal was broad enough to allow for that. And then finally, in October, we will launch phase 2 of this regional program, Being LGBTI in the Caribbean, with the aim to continue working on reducing inequality and exclusion, and to support the adoption and implementation of LGBTI inclusive public policies. Thank you, Albert. I rushed through it, but I hope it gave you some idea of the kind of work we support in the region. Of course, we also work in Latin America, but I decided to focus my remarks on the work in the Caribbean. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Karen. And it's really great to have that snapshot of what UNDP is doing at the regional level in the Caribbean. And I'm really glad you also mentioned UNDP's other regional programs, especially the Being LGBTI in Asia program, which is ongoing and was really the first large-scale program focused specifically on working with LGBTI people within the UN system, and has since been replicated in Eastern Europe and Africa and the Caribbean, as you mentioned. So I'll now turn over to Gregory Garris, who is the Senior Protection Coordinator for Emergencies in the UN Refugee Agency's Division of International Protection, to talk about UNHCR's work with LGBT refugees and asylum seekers. Over to you, Gregory.
Thank you very much, Albert, and thank you to you and your colleagues for the opportunity to talk about our work, and good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever the case may be to everybody. I don't want to put anybody off by the fact that I'm using slides here. I'm still going to try to be concise. I just need these to prompt my, aging mind and make sure that I don't forget anything. So yes, my name is Gregory Garris. I've been working in the Division of International Protection for over a decade in UNHCR in various jobs. But one of the constants in my work has been dealing with the LGBTIQ plus people's portfolio, which is an awkward, we all know that this terminology is an awkward one to use, and it's incomplete and doesn't do justice to the diversity within, on and on and on, constantly changing. So for the purposes of this shorthand, I might say referring to this group with no intention to diminish any of the constituent parts of that. Could we go on to the next slide? So in 2010, I think one of the things that, first of all, there's a few things just to preface this by saying this work on a day-to-day basis, UNHCR in the 100 and however many countries, many hundred, 128 or 50, I can't remember the exact number, it changes. We're confronted on a daily basis in many of those contexts with persons with these profiles who are in serious danger. So we take this issue extremely seriously. Having said that, we certainly understand through the experience of the last more than a decade that getting the capacity one needs to address every situation is not a sprint, and it's not even a marathon. And in fact, there's no end to the investment and focus that one needs to make in this area. We've learned a lot, but it's absolutely the case that it's a long-term commitment that doesn't have, there's no end to the development of staff and all of the other things one needs to do because of the nature of humanitarian work, rotation, et cetera, it's really a matter of continuous investment if you really want to build the capacity. This just gives a little bit of a timeline on some of the key things that we've done as UNHCR through the years. In 2010, we organized the first roundtable on this issue. And at that time, it was 25, 30 people, mostly experts on the adjudication of refugee claims. There was more focus on the actual technical part of adjudicating a refugee claim and the challenges around having those done fairly with people with this profile. And it was less about the protection on a day-to-day basis of persons with this profile. It was very difficult, I should say. I was one of the people organizing that. And it's quite difficult to find enough people to join that particular roundtable. I contrast that with the other end of the arrow, which I'll get to in a minute, but just to say that there were over 600 people that joined our last roundtable, which was a few months ago. So around the same time as the roundtable, we issued what was really landmark guidance to states, this guidance on international protection. UNHCR issues these types of guidance to state systems for consideration by their adjudicators and how to, things to remember when adjudicating certain types of claims. And this was the first time one had been issued on adjudicating these kinds of claims. That's currently being updated, but that was a very, very important, landmark development in the process of, bringing this on the radar of states who are adjudicating LGBTI plus claims. That we also issued our first guidance in 2012, which was called the Need to Know Guidance, and it put out, practical tips on how to work on a day-to-day basis, pointed out some of the key considerations, the need for consultation, et cetera. All of these resources, by the way, will provide links to at the end of the course of the discussion today. We also developed some tools for our own people who, through our mandate in some countries, assess refugee claims that same year. Over the course of the 10-year period, given that we've got limited time here, I'll just say we also started around that time developing our first guidance material and piloting some of the trainings around the world. We did that first kind of by ourselves. We cooperated with a few organizations, but then in 2015, we partnered with IOM and we developed what remains today the only comprehensive training available on protecting LGBTIQ plus people in displacement contexts. We're currently updating that. That is also a resource that we can make available to anybody interested in understanding and looking at it, but it's very, very detailed. I can't remember exactly how many modules in it, but it goes into great detail on the full range of issues that one needs to take account of when doing this work. I should say in 2018, we also have, I mean, by policy before 2018, the need to pay specific attention to the diversity that's within a population, including those with an LGBTIQ plus profile, and the tools to do that were enshrined by policy in UNHCR. In 2018, that policy was updated, but it has been a policy that governs the way we operate in every country where we have a presence. That brings us up to the roundtable, which I mentioned earlier, which we just had in June of this year. It was 2 years in the planning. In the lead up to that, we had a number of live consultations before COVID in different regions of the world to ensure that we were able to consult and hear from every region and those people who may not be able to join what we assumed at that time wrongly, like the rest of the world, would be a live event. It ended up being an online event. And so we had these consultations, and it culminated in what was a 3-week-long roundtable in June, where 13 different thematic issues were discussed over that period. We conceived of that less about a UNHCR kind of driven thing. What we saw ourselves there was as an organization that has a specific platform by virtue of our mandate, but we really wanted to let the discussions be led by and large, the range of different types of organizations and individuals and entities that joined the roundtable. So as you can see here, it's pretty clear, 664 participants. It was a long slog, and it was really demanding a lot of the people that were interested in participating, and we really appreciate that. I think that without having that broad participation, the recommendations would not be nearly as rich as they actually are. This report will also make available to you in the course of today's discussion, the final report, which has all the recommendations that were in the report. I just wanted to point out here what has been very important to us from the beginning is to make sure that the primary voice in how you design and the issues you look at and the strategies you use really has to come from the individuals themselves who are experiencing the situation. So that's either displaced people or refugees, and we really made an effort in the course of the roundtable to involve them. It's a difficult thing because you often deal with people who may be less familiar with all of the those who are more accustomed to joining roundtables and these kinds of discussions. It can be a difficult thing to jump into something like that and be able to find your place and hear your voice. We did the best we could in involving those groups. But critically, at the country level, when you're designing your programs, when you're making your considerations and so forth, that consultation becomes absolutely critical. These are, I don't have to read the objectives of the roundtable there, you can see them. I think one of the most important objectives for us really was to try to, contribute to the building of a really a global coalition working on these issues. And I think to that end, we were quite successful with 600 and some participants. It's true that in humanitarian contexts, there are not many actors, either UN or from civil society or NGOs, at least in the mainstream, who really focus made the investments in this specific area and have the focus. So there's plenty of room. That's not to say there are none. There are certainly many sister UN agencies who made some investments, but there's certainly scope, and NGOs as well. But there is certainly scope for more to join in this work. So that was really one of the key objectives of the thing, was to hear from people who have years of experience, but also to invite people in who have perhaps less experience and expose them to the issues. There was a part of the roundtable which also involved the governments, and there were a number of various governments who've been really steadfast in their support for our and the work of others through the years, who also participated in that. We just go on to the last slide. I'm almost done here, just to highlight some of the key recommendations that came out of the roundtables. The roundtable, there were, I can't remember, the 38 recommendations. Here we're kind of summarizing. Several of the recommendations referred to the same areas. So this is kind of shorthand for some of what we have understood to be the key recommendations. And the first one is what I've already talked about. It really is about strengthening and expanding partnerships and close collaboration with LGBTIQ people. That's both at the country level, those are the most important relationships, but also at the global level. Now, there are challenges with that. We all know that this is, we all work in very, very difficult contexts in some places, where anybody doing this work, including ourselves, has to work somehow in a gray area or under the radar. So the degree to which you can be open about these sorts of partnerships and actively solicit them, and also the degree to which those small partners, many of whom struggle on a day-to-day basis to keep the lights on, and at great personal risk, the degree to which they're, understandably willing to expose themselves is very limited. So that it's very challenging in many contexts to do those partnerships. Those challenges notwithstanding, in many parts of the world, we do have very active partnerships, and those partnerships for us are absolutely critical. We can't do this work alone, and those frontline grassroots organizations that have a difficult enough time advocating for the rights of themselves and other nationals in their own country, who find the space and commitment to expand their work to include people who seek asylum for these same reasons, are doing extraordinary work many places. They're underappreciated and certainly underfunded. One of the key messages that we have in our discussions with supportive states is to make specific funding available to help those organizations with their work, because their number one challenge remains funding. Okay, I'll just go very quickly through the other ones. The importance of an intersectional approach. There was a lot about data, a lot of challenges there. Some of the chief ones are, it's impossible, for example, to say in any calendar year how many persons with an LGBTIQ plus profile were resettled, because there are not a lot of states keep necessarily statistics on the basis of recognition of a refugee claim. And if they do, they would be rolled up into one of the more formal criteria in the 1951 convention, which in this case is most often membership in a social group. And it's not granular down to this social group. So it's very, very challenging there. We've already talked about the frontline operators and the need to strengthen them, reinforcing coordination, communication, collaboration. You'll see that a lot of this is about partnership. A lot of the recommendations were really about coordination at the country level, more collaboration and strategic advocacy, etc. So that in a nutshell is my presentation. I didn't get everything in. I hope I didn't speak too long, but I'm here. I don't know if these links will actually work, so maybe we'll want to put them in the chat or something so you can access some of the materials that I made reference to. Thank you.
Thanks, Gregory, and that would be great if you could share some of those links in the chat. And congratulations also on the organization of the Global Roundtable, which I think really provides a roadmap forward. I will now turn over to Sahar Moazzami, who is the UN Program Officer for Outright Action International, to get the perspective of civil society in terms of their engagement with the UN. Over to you, Sahar.
Thanks so much, Albert. And thank you so much to all of the other panelists for the really informative presentations so far. And of course, really grateful for all the attendees and those watching and on the event for joining in on such an important discussion. As Albert mentioned, my name is Sahar Moazzami, and I work as a UN program officer at a global NGO working to protect and promote the rights of LGBTIQ individuals. Outright is a 31-year-old organization, and the majority of our work is working in the regions directly with grassroots activists on the ground. But we have also been working since our inception at the UN and have had a more robust and focused program since 2015 that primarily works with UN mechanisms here in New York, where I'm based. The UN has historically and continues to play a vital role for LGBTIQ activists advocating for the human rights of LGBTIQ communities across the globe, all the way from the historic UN Human Rights Committee decision in Tunin v. Australia in 1994, decriminalizing same-sex consensual behavior, to UPR recommendations, and of course, the important data that we've heard about today that's produced by UN agencies and entities and the other work that they do. The UN is important for LGBTIQ advocacy for many reasons, including sometimes serving as the only method of recourse when it comes to human rights violations experienced in countries where LGBTIQ lives continue to be criminalized. We at Outright hear countless stories from colleagues on the ground that UN field offices play many roles in their work, including work and advocacy, including serving as places to hold meetings and events to bring visibility to issues facing the community, and working alongside activists to either push for progressive legislation and policies or working against those that further seek to limit individuals' ability to realize the full spectrum of their rights. LGBTIQ activists have also long come to the UN to engage in advocacy to realize the human rights of LGBTI communities globally. So whether it's coming to New York every year for the Commission on the Status of Women, or Outright's flagship program, Advocacy Week, to hold annual meetings with member states and UN agencies and entities, including all of those represented here today. These meetings provide a forum for LGBTIQ individuals to provide background and context to their lived realities, and to provide UN entities with feedback and issue areas to push forward so they can better serve LGBTIQ individuals through their programs. And I wanted to just quickly speak to a couple of examples. I know we've heard through discussions today a great amount of examples of the work being done by these agencies to work directly with LGBTI communities, but just a couple more. Several examples of constructive engagement come to mind when I think about LGBTIQ activism and engagement with the UN, including the creation of LGBTIQ internal guidelines and the diverse SOGIESC post at UN Women, which came to fruition through advocacy done in such annual meetings between the LGBTIQ caucus and UN Women during CSW. So I think it's really important to hold that these things were hard fought and won by LGBTIQ activists. And we're really happy to have Sophie in that position and here at the event today. And of course, I think another important example would be OHCHR's UN Free and Equal campaign, which continues to bring visibility to the array of human rights challenges faced by LGBTIQ individuals, and where country campaigns provide a platform for LGBTIQ community members to be heard and to bring their context and their lived experiences to their very communities and to a global stage. I can go on and I can say so much more about the importance of the UN for LGBTI community members, but with these few examples, and of course the examples shared with us by colleagues in the previous presentations, I think I'll stop there and I'll just hand it back over to you, Albert, and I look forward to continuing the discussion with the audience today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sahar. It's really impossible to understate the role played by organizations like Outright Action International, and Outright in particular. It seems like you're everywhere at once somehow engaged on this topic, in particular at the UN. So finally, I will turn over to Professor Jamie Hagan, lecturer in international relations at Queen's University Belfast and the founding co-director of the Center for Gender and Politics. Jamie has researched, among many other things, the queering of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So she will be reflecting on the engagement on this topic within the UN's Peace and Security pillar. So over to you, Jamie.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you for your work on bringing together what is happening at the UN, because I do think that it's really exciting to hear that 600 people attended that event, and I can't wait to see the report. But it also sometimes can feel, as you know, Sophie stated, I mean, people do not have the capacity and are not being paid to do this work full time. So it can be really scrappy sometimes, right? So I'll reflect on women, peace, and security, but I do think a lot of what I'll speak about is applicable to other issues. So it's not, you know, it has been shared by previous speakers. So just for those who aren't familiar, the Women, Peace, and Security framework is a result of the first resolution 1325, which came through the Security Council to look at women's experiences, to bring a gender perspective to peace and security work. And while that was really groundbreaking and is a result of grassroots organizing, sexual orientation and gender identity are not written into these resolutions. And in fact, there's certainly been there's questions about what gets edited out of resolutions. And again, this is not just specific to women, peace, and security, but given that these are the resolutions looking at a gender perspective, it's a really important space to consider this. So why is it important that that there is an explicit attention to LGBTQ people? And here I'll be reiterating what has been, in some ways, the way we've been hearing from folks today is that it's sort of assumed, but there's actually a lot of contestation around whether or not gender is about LGBTQ people. That is an ongoing frustration in a lot of spaces. But everyone does have a sexual orientation and a gender identity. And to take that seriously means actually explicitly defining these terms, thinking about women and gender separately. And that is really important ongoing work that needs to be stated explicitly again and again, because otherwise there's really damaging assumptions that, you know, it's really fantastic that these modules exist. And that's because people are walking around with assumptions about what gender means, right? So that is actually why it's important to be explicit, right? But I think this recent gender theory report from the independent expert is really, for me, it's just so exciting to see that report come out. It's really powerful to see, you know, a document to the HRC that in the preamble is stating that, quote, only by acknowledging the stereotypes, power asymmetries, inequality, and fundamental violence that lies at the foundation of this system does the state comply with its obligations to address the violence and discrimination that it fuels, with its harrowing impact on women and girls in every corner of the world, including, and this is the part that we're waiting for here, lesbian, bisexual, and trans women, on gay, bisexual, and trans persons, on other gender diverse persons, and on intersex persons. And I just want to state how powerful and important it is that this is being put into documents now. And that, you know, the fact that Sophie only recently started this job, right, that is a huge deal. And so I think that there's still a real lack of communication between silos of silos. Meaning this is, you know, the UN speak of what ends up happening, but you will get some funding here and you'll have a one-off person who gets to do this project here, but where does this 10-year, where does this work over 10 years go, right? So I'm so glad that we're having this event today. And I think that there's so much that has been learned, you know, by these previous speakers that could also influence women, peace, and security initiatives that, let's be honest, do not often have very much funding to work with, do not have the capacity to have someone specifically doing an LGBTQ project necessarily. So what does it mean to, you know, I do think there's progress in talking about women intersectionally, talking about intersectionality. I do think, as we heard from UN Women, hearing about the framework that UN Women is working with, that is a big change. That's actually something that is a very notable change. And I think that while we still have the real frustration with what ends up happening when, in terms of translating training into practice, right? So what happens when, for example, there's in-country developments of a national action plan, and in-country organizers say, actually, we shouldn't be putting LGBTQ issues into this Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. That's not what we're doing here. That's not our job to do here. Let that be for the SOGIE people. And I think one of the, to me, what's really exciting too is that I think it needs to be said that youth, peace, and security people, I don't know that I want to say like a new generation, but there is less of a willingness to let it go. I think that youth, peace, and security actors are saying, actually, we do need to keep gender complicated. Gender is complicated. That's okay. Let's talk about that. And I can say that in the classrooms that I'm teaching in, that's exactly the experience I have. I'm not, obviously there is significant anti-gender backlash. I don't want to minimize that, but it's really exciting when people are interested in keeping the complexity to, sexual orientation, gender identity, recognizing that we can't make assumptions based on, we do, yes, LGBTQ, LGBTI, let's talk about it. Let's keep that complicated. Let's not let that be a reason to not talk about it, right? So I do think that the reasons that there's a lack of engagement in a lot of women, peace, and security spaces with this, I can certainly reflect on it more in the Q&A if people want to talk about this more, but a lot of it does come down to some of the same issues with just looking at gender in general, right? There's a lack of funding. It's the first thing that gets pulled. I do think that there's still, while people may not necessarily be, because when I started doing my research, I was concerned that people were homophobic and transphobic, and that's why they weren't including these issues. And I think actually right now there's a huge gap in knowledge. People understand that it's time to talk about this, but don't actually really feel comfortable doing it. And so that's a huge issue. I also think we do need to reflect more about the funding challenge, because there's that time frame that we saw here of 10 years is a really rapid professionalization of who it is that gets to define the issues in LGBTQ politics and gets to be the organization at the table. And we know that means we have to be very aware of which of the LGBTQ acronym gets to be in the room. And we know that trans organizations are not funded as well. We know that we still have to look at anti-racist organizing and have this intersectional attention in bringing this to LGBTQ work as well. So again, as I said, like this is what I'm looking at specifically in women, peace, and security, but we can look at this in all of the different spaces that we've talked about today. So I will go ahead and leave it at that for now, because I'm excited to hear what questions folks have for us.
Thank you, Jamie. I really appreciate you bringing that perspective to it. And I'm encouraged by your sense of optimism as well. And I've gotten that sense from many of you, actually. So it's really, we don't want to minimize, of course, the really important challenges that remain, but it's encouraging that at least from the perspective of these panelists, we seem to be at this moment in a place of relative optimism. So we're now going over to the Q&A session. And so I would encourage anyone to leave their questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. I'll start off by asking a question of my own. So my sense from hearing from you is that, of course, many UN agencies have become increasingly engaged on issues related to SOGIESC, working with LGBTI people, and have done so often with relatively little, especially in terms of staff capacity and dedicated funding. What sorts of support do you feel like would be most useful for you in your work to carry that forward?
Yeah, first, let me just say, I maybe didn't say it in my presentation. Look, I've been, at least in our area of work, with humanitarian actors and displaced LGBTIQ+ people, there has never been more positive momentum, never been more interest from states. We're at a moment that has never existed in the course of time. So the momentum is positive. And I think we really need to make hay while the sun shines, notwithstanding the many challenges. But I just want to reiterate, I believe in our work, one of the most important things is finding ways to support the grassroots organizations, and some of them led by displaced and refugee persons, LGBTIQ plus people. That is really essential. The point that Jamie, so many of your points resonated, they were really great. One thing that really is challenging is to find that sweet spot between dealing with what are very complex issues and not making it those people, and I believe I made the same assumptions that you mentioned, that we're facing a lot of phobias out there. But in fact, I believe that the majority of our staff are actually very committed and willing to work in this area. They feel they just don't have the vocabulary, and they're hesitant for those reasons. So that's the challenge, that you want to make people in the rank and file who are the frontline workers comfortable enough to speak, have discussions, develop their skills here. But that's where working with these grassroots organizations, we'll never have the lived experience and the expertise and the understanding that they have. So those partnerships, from my perspective, if I had to prioritize one area, one ask of states would be to find, and there's a growing coalition of states like the Netherlands, but the Biden administration has made this a top priority in many other countries. My number one recommendation would be find ways to make funding available that are for those organizations that are on the front line, and of course done in a way that doesn't expose them to risk, but also provide what political cover you can with the same do no harm caveat. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Or if not, we can go to other questions. I'll ask a couple other questions that we've gotten from audience members, and I'll ask a couple at once, and you can all feel free to jump in on any of those. So we have a question from Piotr, and he has a question on strategy in terms of programming. So his question is whether violence based on SOGIESC is better linked with work addressing other kinds of hate crimes, such as based on race or religion, or whether it's best tackled within a specifically LGBTI discrimination framework. What's easier or better? And so I sort of see that as reflecting on the extent to which this issue is something to be addressed alongside other areas of discrimination, or as its own dedicated topic in terms of programming. And then we also have a question from Agat, and she asks, looking from an institutional perspective, whether you'd want to see a dedicated department or dedicated place within the UN that is championing this issue, or whether the current model of it being championed by a variety of different UN entities is the way forward. Does anyone want to weigh in on either of those? Yes.
But maybe I'll come in on violence. I think that, there's no easier or better way. I think one would take a broader approach and link to other issues around discrimination, with making alliances with key actors at the national level. But I think our strategy is basically to work very closely with LGBTI CSOs on the ground, because they understand the context, and you don't want to take an approach that would put them at greater risk. So I think what we do within a given context is always based on working closely with the actors that are on the ground, understand the national context, and making those alliances. So I don't think there's a better or easier way. I mean, yeah, I don't know, Sahil, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks so much, Karen. I mean, I would completely agree that I don't think there's one easier or better way, but I guess just to extend on your response, what I think is really important when thinking about violence based off of any identity or category as such is actually looking at the root causes and what that violence is trying to achieve. How violence is used to uphold and sustain power structures that continue to uphold patriarchy and various forms and systems of oppression that keep our power systems in balance. So I think what's really important is to take that kind of gender analysis and deeper analysis on why this violence is occurring. And of course, working directly with civil society on the ground to get specific context is key in any discussions when coming to LGBTI advocacy or issues.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on either of those questions? I think the question on the sort of institutional approach to this work in terms of it currently being led by a number of different UN agencies speaks to questions around coordination, which I know is something that you in particular raised, Gregory. So I didn't know if anyone wanted to reflect on some of the challenges related to coordination within the UN system, or some successful examples of coordination or cooperation among the many different UN or non-UN actors working in this space. And related to that, we have a couple of questions from people wondering how they can interact with the UN coming from outside the system. So we have a question from Bruce, who's an interfaith leader working in this field. And so he's asking what faith leaders can do to promote SOGIE equality at the UN or globally. And then we also have a question from someone who's wondering if there are funds or areas of support within the UN that LGBT plus persons or activists can turn to for support. Yeah, Gregory.
I'm sorry to take the floor again. On the issue of coordination, I think we're certainly seeing developments at the global level within the UN system, you know, a greater interest in coordination. We work very closely with OHCHR. As our colleague from UNDP mentioned, we have some cooperation in different parts of the world with UNDP, but clearly we can all do better on that. So that really is an important point, and I think it's foremost in the minds of several of us who work at UN different organization headquarters, and something that we'll probably deal with before the end of the year. I think we'll figure out a better way to communicate, but it's, you know, I don't know whether an exclusive UN fora is the best way to go, or one that involves, you know, many actors. But anyway, these are the things that we need to discuss. What I do the point that I do want to make, though, that is very challenging, is that, you know, different UN organizations, by virtue of their mandates, I suppose, have moved at different speeds. We've all recognized that. But what we encounter sometimes at the country level is just a different level of understanding, and sometimes resistance, as somebody made reference to earlier, within UN country teams, simply because they're the representative of whatever organization is not necessarily familiar with the issues. So I think we all, as individual organizations, have a lot to do in terms of messaging from our leadership about the importance of the issue. As someone who's worked on this, you know, for the better part of 10 years, one of the most essential things that has helped, you know, make the progress that we've made has been the real commitment from our previous High Commissioner, who's now the Secretary General, and our current High Commissioner, to send out these messages to all staff, reinforcing the criticality of this work, irrespective of whatever your views are. If you're a UNHCR staff member, you know, this is an important issue for the organization. Those senior management messages are absolutely essential, and I think all of us need to bear that in mind to make sure that, you know, we have that kind of messaging coming from our senior leadership. But I do think we're moving. I feel very positive about the direction things are moving within the UN, and in terms of better coordination to take advantage of the, the various, how our work can be very complementary at the field level, where it really matters, and at the advocacy level, frankly.
I had a couple thoughts, if I could come in as well. So I think part of it is both and, right? So think queerly, like think about LGBTQ pots of funding, but also, part of women, peace and security is also peace building. Queer and trans organizations have lots to say about what's important to peace building and what needs to be part of post-conflict peace building. So I think that because of necessity and the lack of funding and lack of attention, almost all of the conversations we've been having have been about crisis, have been about conflict, have been about violence. But that's not the only dimension of, queer experience. And so I would just say that for people who are wondering about how to get involved, I do think it's partially about being part of the conversations, whether or not it's about, religion and peace building, be part of these spaces and bring this conversation to that. And as we've said today, there's more space opening up to start to do that. And you can draw on what we've been, you could say, look, there's these other UN agencies that have been doing this, like how can we be a part of that conversation? How can we network that? That I think is a really important thing to be doing right now. And I do think that, it really has to be both and, because of all kinds of, fund shifts and funding. Who's in the government? Are you able to really take up certain issues from year to year? So I think we have to be really creative and really collaborative, which is the other reason why women, peace and security and LGBTQ issues should be talked about together. Is there's an obvious opportunity for collaboration between funding and in this limited space. So those are just some of the things that I was thinking about, and I think is a way to maybe push through this idea of I need to be going to the SOGIESC space to be talking about this, and actually saying, no, we can talk about that in this space that you're already working, that you have connections. So that would be, my 2 cents.
Thank you, Jamie. Anyone else on this topic?
Maybe just to say, Albert, what I've seen in terms of better coordination is actually happening at the level of at the country level. So we're under the UN country team. It seems to be that better coordination is happening there. At least it's getting better, and that there, for example, collaborative work, whether it's through a gender committee that's part of the UN country team, or for example, in Guyana, during Pride Month, the UN country team asked us to do some training for them to kind of look at how they can include issues related to sexual orientation, gender identity in their work. And so it begins to be more of a conversation at the country level and partnership. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to share a comment from Cliff Cortez, who I'm glad is able to participate. Cliff is the Global Advisor on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity at the World Bank. So one of the other people within the UN, the broader UN system working specifically on this topic. And he just wanted to share that during the UN General Assembly this month, the World Bank will be launching the first in a series of reports analyzing laws that affect LGBTIQ plus people. And the first report covers 16 countries, with a larger set of countries by the time of the second report. And it's hoped that this analysis will be helpful to UN member states, as well as CSOs and others. So I just wanted to flag that, especially because the World Bank has also been one of the leaders in moving forward this work within the area of sustainable development. I wanted to ask a question raised by Neela Ghoshal from Human Rights Watch. Neela asks, do you see any risk of capture of parts of the UN system by so-called gender critical feminists who oppose trans liberation? Have you seen such groups engaging at CSW, for instance? How can the UN protect trans people from the risk that these spaces could become increasingly hostile to them? anyone like to take that question?
I guess my first thought is they already are hostile. So it's not a question of they could be. And it's more about what are the commitments that UN agencies can make to state up front that that is not something that's tolerated, and that, you know, states can make. I think we cannot assume that it cannot be unsaid. You know, it can't remain unsaid. It has to be spoken directly. So I guess my first thought immediately, and I'm seeing Sarah not, is like, these are the default has been a space that's been exclusionary and violent. So
yeah, Gregory.
Yeah, no, I would agree entirely with that. You know, it is very difficult to get some people to break out of their kind of focus and understand that if you do not work hard and invest in making whatever it is you're delivering accessible to, and include them in the design and discussions and so forth, you're de facto delivering programs which exclude people. And we've encountered that in many discussions over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, and had many long, difficult debates about who belongs in what guidance, precisely because of these kind of blinkered views that some hold. And, you know, if it's going to be inclusive, it's inclusive. Having said that, I don't think they've been able to, you know, stop progress in any way. I think progress marches forward, and I believe the coalition of people that understand is larger than the naysayers. That's my feeling, and I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about it. I truly believe that.
I think that also points to the issue that when we talk about LGBTIQ plus people, we're talking about a really broad and diverse group of people. And progress is not necessarily even in terms of working with all the different parts of that community. I was wondering if any of you had reflections on working with different groups within the LGBT IQ plus community, and where particular focus might be needed, where there might be people being most left behind.
Maybe so that we don't have silence, I can try and contribute, Albert. You know, when maybe 6-7 years ago, when I moved to the region, I think a lot of trans organizations were still included in sort of like a gay umbrella. But I think over the past years, we've seen trans organizations being established, that they have their own programs, but they continue to, and especially during COVID, were quite hard hit. So we had, you know, trans organizations still struggling with like paying rent for the premises, etc. But what we've done is to ensure in the work that we do is to make sure that, for example, we have representation of trans people on the UNDP project board, that they're part of how the project is designed, etc. But also to make sure that there's specific funding available to make sure that, you know, if there's that kind of crisis, that one can support it. But I think that there's still a lot of support needed for nascent trans organizations in the Caribbean.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I wanted to come back to the topic of engagement with faith leaders, as that question has come up again. From Bruce Knotts from the Unitarian Universalist Association, who says that faith traditions can also be a problem there's also a role for progressive faith traditions in promoting equity. So he's wondering about the role that faith can play in these efforts within the UN. And then I might also just add to that, many of you are working in, or your agencies are working in, a really wide range of geographic areas, which have completely different environments in levels of support, both from governments and from the public in terms of this work. So I'd also be interested if any of you have reflections on the challenges of engaging in less conducive environments and how you tailor your work to make sure that you're responding to the needs of LGBTI people in such a wide range of contexts, facing such a wide range of challenges. Gregory.
Sorry again to take the floor. I basically have something to say on every issue, but I try to control myself.
Go ahead.
On your first point, on the first point about faith leaders and the role that faith-based organizations and leadership can play, it's very, very important. You know, a few years back, we had a kind of global dialogue, not specifically focused on LGBTIQ+ people, but more broadly about, you know, what faith-based organizations and entities and individuals can bring to the whole refugee IDP context. And this issue came up, and there are many, many around the world who are willing and actually actively doing things. So I will cite one very important contribution, and that is private sponsorship for relocation for people that are in you know, imminent danger in refugee situations. We all know that the spaces available for resettlement globally have fluctuated rather dramatically over the course of the last couple of years. And there's never enough. I mean, it's less than 1% of refugees of any profile that will ever get anywhere near resettlement. There's never enough spots. We know that many, but not all people within an LGBTIQ+ profile will need, you know, the only solution available to some is resettlement, but I emphasize not all. And so these complementary pathways through private sponsorship, which, you know, the most important pilots for those are in Canada at the moment. That's a really important role for faith-based organizations to play internationally or domestically in their own country. Advocate for more spaces for those kinds of capacities.
Thanks, Gregory. Anyone else on that topic? If not, I'll just ask a couple final questions because we're coming to the end of our time. And if any of you have concluding remarks you'd like to share as well, I would welcome any of you to make those. But just a couple final questions from the audience. One is from Nick Moulet, who asks if the panelists have any thoughts about key principles that apply to policy design related to SOGIESC issues, and given that these issues apply to populations in a wide range of nation states. And then another point is that this comes from Adam, and he says that many staff don't necessarily have the resources and guidance to support pushing the envelope on these issues. Some UN entities, such as UNICEF, don't yet have programming guidance on SOGIESC. If we hope for a UN system that moves forward in a coherent, coordinated, and cost-effective way, these inconsistencies across the system need to be addressed. So I guess the question from that would be, what do you think is needed in terms of policies or guidance coming from the UN in order to move this work forward? So I'll open up the floor to addressing any of those questions or sharing any final thoughts.
I can jump in, and I recognize that a lot of the questions are really pointing directly from our colleagues from UN agencies, but I guess to just share some final thoughts on the civil society or outright side, I think a couple of key things have been really touched on throughout this conversation that warrant repeating and reiteration always. And one of them, very much was around coordination. I think we see, and we've heard today of some great best practices already in place by all of the entities present today. And we know that there are so many more that have been present in this conversation. And one thing I could say is just the sharing and the coordination amongst entities and UN agencies is just so key. Something like an internal LGBTI guidance document by an entity like UN Women, we heard can be so helpful for other agencies and entities that don't have that guidance. So how can we create coordination mechanisms, hold dialogues like these, but also understand that sometimes there needs to be dialogues that aren't public like this, but more internal amongst agencies and entities to ensure that those best practices and the lessons learned after implementation of those practices can be shared across. I think another key learning and understanding was that I think there are so many policies and best practices to put into place when putting into action these policies. But first and foremost, it always needs to be holding up the do no harm principle and working directly with grassroots organizations on the ground and listening and hearing from them what is most helpful in their context before putting into place any of these policies or being vocal on any such thing, because sometimes we know that that can counteract efforts that are being done, and sometimes more quiet diplomacy is needed, sometimes more vocal and out there, but the only way to know that is to really be working directly with groups on the ground in those contexts. And then last but certainly not least, I think overall what we were hearing is trying to continuously counteract the siloing of LGBTI, as LGBTI is this one entity, this one idea, concept, so on and so forth, and making sure that we're really speaking to a more expansive intersectional understanding of LGBTI. It's not just women and LGBTI folks. It's not just people with disabilities and then people who identify with diverse SOGIESC. There are very much individuals within the community with multiple and intersecting identities, and how within all of the work that we're doing, not just the ones that fall under our LGBTI specific programming, how are we reinforcing that understanding and making it a cross-cutting issue in the work that we're doing. So just a couple of things that I think were worth re-mentioning. And again, it's been really interesting to be in this conversation with all of you, and I hope we can continue that going forward.
Jamie?
Sure. Yeah. So all of that totally, especially about I have to say that I'm gathering all these resources and will definitely be learning from them. So I think that, as I said earlier, a lot of times it's just one of my concerns, and one of the things that we've seen as a problem is that when the limited resources go out, the limited projects go out for this, it's done in a way that, although there is the framework of do no harm, we know that a lot of times calls aren't translated. A lot of times, there's lots of research out of Columbia that's not translated. And a lot of times the limited amount of funding goes to reproducing. I'm going to say some kind of bummer things, but I have some good things to say too. There's a lot of amazing research out there that hasn't been translated and hasn't been communicated across. And I think we're at a place where we can be doing a lot more implementing if we can just get that moving, right? And I will say that, which is why I am hopeful about women, peace, and security, and do see, even in the past 6 months, it's been really remarkable to see the interest from different governments, from NGOs, seeing let's make these linkages. We can do this work now. We can have these conversations openly. And yeah, there's definitely stuff going on behind the scenes that we don't even know about, right? But I did want to say back to the, talking about faith and LGBTQ organizing, I moved to Belfast in 2019, and before I moved to the UK, I, doing some Googling around about queer community here, and it came up, I found the story that says it's the worst place to be queer in the UK. And I think that to me is just something that I'm constantly questioning, the place that we're told is not safe to be. I mean, I think we need to complicate what it means to say that it's not a safe place to be queer, because LGBTQ people are experiencing, all kinds of experiences. It's a very broad community. So because of the lack of funding and the lack of time that's been devoted to this, we kind of reproduce some limited ideas about a very big community. So I think that now hopefully is the generation where we can start teasing that apart a bit more. And I just want to say that in Northern Ireland, there's definitely work about faith and LGBTQ experience. And just last year, Fidelma Ash is doing work on this, who's at the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University. Richard O'Leary is also doing work. And so there's a lot that was I attended an event at Ulster, and a lot of what they were talking about is the importance of storytelling, the importance of being able to have a space where people can actually give their own voice and their own lived experience in a room and have the ability to have that taken seriously. And so I would just say that there is interest, there is ongoing work about that. And I can try to grab some references to drop in the chat box really quickly, but definitely check out some of those resources. And again, I'm just really grateful for this space to have this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Gregory.
Yeah, thanks. I don't have any dramatic final thoughts other than to say, I think what is important, we all talked about it, is, identifying, really putting effort into identifying those partnerships and coordination, and also being humble. We've invested a lot, and we're delighted to share and have a discussion with anybody who's interested in hearing about our experience. But we certainly understand that we're constantly learning. What we've learned so far has been through collaborating mostly with refugees and IDPs with lived experience. And we have a lot more work to do and a lot more to learn. And I think that's the way to approach this. But I do think sharing good practice, sharing the guidance, sharing the policies is a good start. So anybody on the call who's interested, more than happy to have a conversation about how we might share what, and obviously we're interested in learning from you as well. So we're very, very open to collaboration. And I honestly want to close on a positive note, and it's not rhetoric. There's never been a better time, from my perspective, to move this agenda forward. So it's really important that we collectively take advantage of that wave and really move things. Progress is not as fast as we'd like. It's incremental in some ways, but progress is there, and we've got more momentum than ever to make that. So if I have any closing words, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Gregory. We're just at our 90 minutes, but any final thoughts, Karen?
No, just thanks so much for having us participate, or having me participate. And I think it was really nice to engage with colleagues on the call. That most of what I wanted to say has been said, but I think one of the things that we do recognize is also that the UN can play a role at national level of bringing together LGBTI civil society with decision makers, with government leaders, and we can play that important convening role together as UN agencies. And I think that's something that we'd like to work in partnership with, but it was really great to be on the panel with everyone. Nice to meet all of you.
Thanks, Karen. I think that's a great note to end on in terms of reflecting on the comparative advantage of the UN in bringing together civil society and all the other actors working on this topic. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today, especially because I think every single one of the panelists is in a different time zone. So especially for those of you for whom it's been late in the day, we only were able to dip our toes into this topic here today, but I hope all of you who are able to join this event will remain engaged with us in the coming months and years. Thank you all for your participation and have a wonderful rest of your day.